In 1942, a young Peter O'Donnell was in charge of a radio detachment in Persia, now Iran. And his company, their job was to see if the Germans were coming through the Caucasus to seize the oil fields in the Middle East. And at one time, they are camped by a river, and there are many Balkan refugees coming through. And there's a little girl that shows up. She must have been maybe 12 years old. She's all by herself. And they begin to call out to her in different languages, in Arabic and Persian and the other languages the men knew. But she doesn't respond to them. Now she's cautious, but she's unafraid. She's got a bundle on top of her head, which you'll soon learn has some food. And there's something around her neck that O'Donnell can't make out yet. She begins to wash by a river, all this time keeping an eye on the men. And eventually O'Donnell and some of the other men, the soldiers, they gave provisions to her. They don't approach her directly, they leave it on the side. It's tin, food and tin, and also a can opener, which they're not sure if she knows how to use, but they show her from a distance. She figures out how to use it, and she smiles. And that smile touched O'Donnell quite a bit. They begin to call out to her, but she doesn't respond, and until initially she doesn't respond. And when she does, it's in a language they can't understand. After she finishes eating and washing, she gets up, thanks them in a language they can't understand, and she just walks down the river. And to quote O'Donnell, he says that she was like a princess, moving away from me and those brave, skinny little legs. And he never knew whatever happened. He never knew what happened to her. 20 years later, after he had created the comic strip Modesty Blaise in the early 1960s for British newspapers, he needed an origin story. And that little girl, who was still in his mind, was the source for it. And he wrote this little story in the beginning. And what he did, he had this little girl who was a Hungarian refugee whose parents had been killed during the German and Russian offensive. And she survives, and she goes to a refugee camp in Greece. And it's suggested in this story and in others that her time there was quite brutal. At one point, she meets this old man whose provisions are being taken from him, and she helps him. She takes pity on him. And this man happens to be a Jewish professor from Budapest, and he takes her under his care to be her tutor, and in turn she is his protector. His name is Locke. And for the next couple of years they traveled through North Africa and through the Middle East. And Locke knows at least 5 languages, and in many ways he is like the professor in The Count of Monte Cristo, when Edmond Dante is wrongfully in prison, and the man next to him, in the cell next to him, is a professor who's just a genius. And when they meet, he teaches Edmond Dante just everything he needs to know, and eventually creates the avenging angel, the Count of Monte Cristo. And what this old man does, Locke does, is basically the same thing for Modesty. And he's the one who comes up with her name, Modesty. The little girl does not discuss her past. And he calls her Modesty because she seems to be in a state of undress. She's still rather a wild child. Later, she will take the last name Blaise because he teaches her about the Arthurian legends, and Merlin's tutor is named Blaise. So she just takes that name, Modesty Blaise. So this little girl's past is gone. She's recreated herself, and in one of the novels written by Peter O'Donnell about Modesty Blaise, there's a line that says, if there's something terrible has happened, she's remembering something that happened to her when she was a child, she says, that was somebody else, somebody I used to know a long time ago. And it reminds me of a line from The Go-Between by an English writer named Hartley. And to paraphrase it, the past is another country. They do things differently there. And in many ways, that is the story of Modesty Blaise. Her past is a mystery, and we just get glimpses of it in the comic strip and in the novels. So, back to the strip. After a few years with Locke, he dies when she's like 17 years old, and they're on the road to Tangiers. And in Tangiers, she starts working at a casino, and she's very smart, and she quickly picks up on things. And this casino is run by a racketeer. When he dies 2 years later, and she's 19, she takes over, and she renames it the Network. And they deal in gambling and theft. Nothing malicious like murder or human trafficking or drugs. And she becomes quite successful, extremely wealthy. In one of her trips to Saigon, she meets a man named Willie Garvin, who is a fighter and pretty good with knives. He's jailed, and she takes him out of prison. She bails him out of jail. He doesn't know why. But he says something to the effect of, why would you help this rat? And she says, I see a man in you. And he becomes quite devoted to her. And he begins to call her the princess. Much like O'Donnell called that little girl from 20 years earlier the princess. And they have a criminal enterprise, but again, it's rather mild. And when Modesty is in her late 20s, she's just extremely rich, as is Willie, and they just retire. And they break up the network among the chiefs, and they just go on their way. But they're very restless. They're just too used to adventure. And when the British intelligence contacts them to do a rather unorthodox job, which is portrayed in the first comic that they wrote, Peter O'Donnell and Jim Holdaway, the artist, wrote the Gabriel setup. A machine. They come out of retirement to help British intelligence, and they do it not for pay, they do it for the adventure. And this starts off our story. Now, the relationship between Modesty and Willie is not sexual, and it's not even exactly like brother and sister. It's a deeper intimacy. If anything, it's a much healthier relationship. It's the antithesis of Wuthering Heights of Heathcliff and Catherine, which is passionate, sexually passionate, and very destructive. But at the core of it is this love that they have for each other. And that's the same it is with Willie and with Modesty. And Willie's an ex-legionnaire. Like what I mentioned earlier, he's very good with knives, and he likes to quote the Psalms. Although he's not a religious man, he just always quotes from the Psalms. And one of the things that fascinates me about Modesty Blaise is that, like I mentioned earlier, when she has that line, remembering bad things that happened to her, when she says that was somebody else, somebody I used to know a long time ago. She's got no self-pity of any kind. She's not the type, when she tells something personal, she expects someone to hug her. And she's very conscientious of others. I mean, if she's going to do something, even if it means, if she's in a situation where she has to I mean, she's in deep danger, but if it means that her rescue or her escaping will harm others, she won't do it. She'll think of another option. So she's got a very strong moral code. And and I guess she's very loyal to Willie. And Willie's extremely loyal to her. Now, back to the origin story. What that little girl had, the little girl that Peter O'Donnell saw, the little refugee child, is the girl had around her neck a piece of cloth, and attached to the cloth was a long nail attached to a wooden shaft, which O'Donnell just had to assume was a weapon. And in one of the, I think it was 13 novels of that Peter O'Donnell wrote about Modesty Blaise, and the Xanadu Talisman, he goes back to that origin story where that little girl has that same, little Modesty has that same weapon, and she has to use it. And we learn more about her, what happened to her when she was a child. And she is a child when she uses that weapon. Now, we all know human history, what happens during times of war, or for children or women when they're on their own in rather dangerous places. We know what's going to happen to them. And it happens to Modesty. But again, there's no sense of victimhood in her of any kind. And one of the joys of the strips is that. And certainly in this Xanadu Talisman, this novel, which goes more into her background, you also have this, you basically have more of the intimacy between her and Willie, and how close they are, and how loyal they are to each other. The story opens with an earthquake, and Modesty is at a hotel, and how she survives that earthquake in the hotel is just astounding. And there's another scene later on, Willie comes to her rescue. And there's another one when Willie himself is submerged in this pit of water, and how she comes to save him. And at the end of the novel, there's this incredible gladiator fight where Modesty takes on these two men, these two brothers, who were trained assassins. And shortly thereafter, Modesty is Willie has to save Modesty from a panther. And if what O'Donnell's able to do is he's able to take, regarding his writing style, he's very good, almost at the par of Edgar Rice Burroughs in the Tarzan books, when he can depict an adventure scene, a fight scene, and it just keeps you completely engrossed. But it's restrained in a way as if almost like Graham Greene met Edgar Rice Burroughs. And one thing that Greene is good, Greene is really good at motive and intent and conscience, which Peter O'Donnell is able to do in the strip and in the novels. In the Xanadu Talisman, there's a criminal organization called El Mico that's led by the woman named Nanny Pendergrast, and she says what she is. She's a nanny to these two orphaned boys that she wants to turn into gentlemen and assassins. And it's one of the better novels that I've read in at least this last year. I pretty much enjoyed this, and it made me go back to the strips. And I think if you're going to begin with Modesty Blaise, the best place to begin is with the Volume 1 of the Titan Publications, the Gabriel setup. This one has her origin story and the initial stories published in the early 60s in the British paper. And they have essays and introductions by Peter O'Donnell. One of the things I found interesting in one of these series, I learned that he was a fan of Neil Gaiman's Sandman. And in this one, there's a blurb by Neil Gaiman in the back, and by Chris Claremont, the writer from the X-Men. Thank you for viewing, and if you get a chance, please check out this wonderful comic strip by Peter O'Donnell and Jim Holdaway, who was the initial artist before he passed away and others took over. But they stayed basically true to modesty. Modesty Blaise. What a lovely way to burn.